Okay, well, good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are, and thank you for joining us. My name is Siddharth Roy. I'm a research scientist at Virginia Tech, and I also moderate the environmental engineering and science community at Heterodox Academy. And I'm delighted that so many of you are going to spend the next hour with us, and we'll try to have a wide-ranging conversation. Ivan wears many hats, so we'll try to see if you can talk about everything from academic freedom and the First Amendment to shoddy science and research misconduct, how some people get away with it, others don't. And we'll do all this through the prism of journal retractions, one of the central ways science corrects itself. And so there should be about 15, 20 minutes for questions at the end as well. So, very quickly, we're a small group focused primarily in the subfield of environmental engineering and science. And our central goal is to foster true viewpoint diversity in our scholars. And to this end, we have a closed online group that provides scholars and teachers a platform to discuss and debate ideas in good faith. And we sometimes host many of these events. There are conferences, workshops, things like that. So, one of the examples of an event we did about 2 years ago was focused on the pandemic as it was getting started, kind of looking at it from the environmental engineering approach. And we brought in some cutting-edge scholars to share their research with us. So the format for today is, I'll take about 4 to 5 minutes to welcome all of you and welcome Ivan, introduce him. We'll have a wide-ranging conversation. I have a few scripted questions, but we can do follow-ups depending on time. And then about 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. And you can use the Q&A option in Zoom to directly send us questions. And if you're on Twitter, there's a hashtag, Retraction Talk. Feel free to post stuff there. So with that, let me introduce Ivan. Dr. Ivan Oransky is editor-in-chief of Spectrum and a distinguished writer-in-residence at New York University's Carter Journalism Institute, where he teaches medical journalism in the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program. Previously, he was vice president of editorial at Medscape, VP and global editorial director of MedPage Today, executive editor of Reuters Health, managing editor online of Scientific American and many other publications. He's also a past president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. Dr. Oransky earned his bachelor's at Harvard, where he was the executive editor of the Harvard Crimson, and an MD at the NYU School of Medicine. In 2015, the American Medical Writers Association awarded him the John P. McGovern Award for Excellence in Biomedical Communication, and the University of the South awarded him an honorary doctorate of civil laws in 2017. He's also co-founder of Retraction Watch, and he'll be speaking with us today wearing that hat. Ivan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Oh, my pleasure, Sid. Really appreciate you having me, talking about these issues.
Perfect. We have about 45 people, so this should be a very interesting conversation. Let's I guess talk about the history of Retraction Watch first. I mean, you co-founded Retraction Watch in 2010 with Adam Marcus, and it seems to me you've always been skeptical about science and scientists. I actually found an article that you wrote for the Harvard Crimson in '93 titled "Questioning the Experts' Motives." So tell me a bit about what you and Adam were thinking specifically about retractions and starting the organization.
Sure. No, thanks, Sid. I was chuckling there. They digitized the Crimson's archives. I don't remember exactly when, but I want to say 20 years ago or so. And I think all of us, and this is, by the way, pre-Twitter, pre-social media, that really hadn't made its way into everybody's consciousness. We all, I think, cringed a bit because the things you say when you're 19 or 18 or 22, sometimes they're actually embarrassing. Often they make you cringe because, my political leanings have shifted a bit, not markedly, but it's sort of some things I said that in retrospect, don't regret, but it's funny you picked that up, and I've looked back at some of those things. Every now and then I tweet them almost in a defensive posture, sort of, oh, yeah, see, you can't find anything on me because it's already there. Go for it. So Adam and I, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about what I guess feels like a bit of ancient history here, not quite as far back as 1993, but Adam and I co-founded Retraction Watch and launched it in August 2010, really on the heels of a major story that he had broken and really owned as the editor at the time of Anesthesiology News, which is a trade publication for, as you can imagine, anesthesiologists. And he had written about, because he was so in touch with all of his sources were anesthesiology researchers and journal editors and people like that, who were, really kind of at the cutting edge of what was happening in the field. He wrote about someone named Scott Rubin, who back in the, sort of really the early to mid aughts, was doing work, and I'll tell a sort of pretty short version of this story. There's lots more detail available, of course. But he ended up, he was studying something called a Celebrex, which some who are on the Zoom today may recall has what's known as a black box warning now. It's a painkiller that was supposed to be sort of cleaner and safer than ibuprofen and Advil, those sort of what are called NSAIDs. Again, I'm telling the oversimplified version of this story, but the reason he came to the attention of journal editors and people at his institution, which was Tufts, but he was up in Springfield, Massachusetts, working at the hospital there, was that it turned out he had made up all the patients in his clinical trials. And these were clinical trials that were pretty influential. People were citing them and quoting them in guidelines and things like that, pretty well thought of. And so once that story started to unravel, he did end up having 25 retractions, but even worse than that, and I'll get to how many, when we may get to, I should say, whether that's a big number or a small number, and sort of put that in context probably a bit later. But he also went to federal prison, it turned out, for charges related to the scientific misconduct that he had conducted, and also paid some restitution. And this, I wouldn't say opened my eyes to the fact that misconduct happened, or even opened my eyes to the fact that retractions happened, but opened my eyes to this particular story and the fact that they were hiding in plain sight. And Adam is a tremendous reporter, remains a tremendous reporter, terrific writer, but nobody else was telling this story until he did. And it got me thinking, and I'd even written about corrections and retractions over time, but not much. Maybe there's a lot of stuff that nobody's talking about. And as journalists, and that's, despite whatever degrees and experience I have, my core identity is as a journalist. I love doing, and we still do, we file public records requests, we do all sorts of things like that. We get leaks, we get, people give us documents anonymously. But at the end of the day, if you have this what turns out to be a pretty big treasure trove of cases of misconduct, essentially hiding in plain sight that you can just go and find, not as well as you should, and we're going to get to that too. It's like, oh, that's pretty interesting. And by the way, when we looked at all these retraction notices, they barely ever told you the real story. They might tell you part of the story. They might not say anything at all, just, oh, this was withdrawn. I'm sorry, that's all we're going to tell you. And that seemed like a transparency problem for science. Probably a bigger reason, or a more important reason, to start the blog than, oh, there are a lot of stories out there that we could be telling, but as journalists, that's, in large part what motivated us. But then we were sort of off to the races. And in an early example of learning very quickly how wrong we were about our own assumptions and what we thought that there were a few dozen retractions a year. I mean, Adam was quoted actually in the New York Times several months after we launched, saying that, we thought there'd be 2 or 3 retractions a month, and we'd write about them. And I think he said something like, and our mothers would read it. And, we're reasonably sure our mothers are reading it. We're not totally, no, I think our mothers read it. But, it turned out that even just among journals, and that's not the total, that's not the sum, the total, but even among journals that year, 2010, there were 400 retractions, not 2 dozen or 3 dozen, but we were off by an order of magnitude, maybe more than that. And so I think that's actually important like to learn you're wrong quickly and then figure it out. And that led to some other things like our database, which we now, keep up to date. Of course, we launched that in 2018, and it's the largest database of retractions. And that actually we just surpassed, our researcher told me yesterday or Monday that we're above 34,000 retractions now in our database. So anyway, that's the longer version than you probably wanted, but that's sort of what we've, why we launched, and sort of some of the things we've learned, and the rates of retraction are of course increasing, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about that as well.
No, that's I mean, crucial. I think just the idea that, bad science happens. Let's look into this phenomena, and most reasonable people agree that there's a spectrum probably of bad science. You have honest mistakes and some sloppiness on the one end, to really bad study design or comically small sample sizes, to deliberate fabrication and falsification. In your journey over the past 12 or so years, are there specific examples that like stand out to you, that they're the most egregious, outlandish cases of misconduct? And perhaps you could even plug in the now infamous Retraction Watch leaderboard.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit today. I don't have any, my wife and I don't have any children, but it's a bit probably like asking, well, which one's your favorite child, and well, they're all my favorite children. We do have a leaderboard, so thank you for prompting me to mention that. We have a leaderboard of retractions. One of the little, dirty little secrets of a lot of journalists is that many of us, sort of secretly aspire to be sports journalists. So the leaderboard is sort of, if you will, if ESPN ran Retraction Watch, that's what it would look like. It's so, and we go down to 30 on our leaderboard, and the numbers change obviously, and people have more retraction. There are 4 people on that list with more than 100 retractions each, and that really hasn't, that's sort of only been true recently. There's one person at the top of the list who's probably worth a mention. He's got 183, I think the number is. Another anesthesiologist, and before you all, stop watching the Zoom and go cancel whatever surgery you've got scheduled, thinking I don't trust anesthesiologists, I would argue the opposite might be true. The fact that anesthesiologists, who do show up pretty prominently in the leaderboard, for example, Scott Rubin was a pain researcher, anesthesiologist. I would argue that actually means I trust the field more. It means that people are paying attention. We can debate that, and that might be a good subject to discuss. But he was someone who, and what's interesting about the story to us, one of the things interesting about the story is how long it actually took the community to figure that out. Some people in the community figured it out almost as soon as he started publishing, but it took another, really a decade, actually longer than that, I think 12 years, for anyone to sort of point out, for anyone to pay attention. There was a letter that was published saying, oh, Yoshitaka Fuji, his data seem, too perfect, basically. And someone said, oh, no, he just got lucky, and, it's great, sort of thing. Well, turns out he was making it all up. There's probably the most famous case, I think, of or at least maybe not the most famous case, but the most prominent, and maybe the case that has had the most impact, which is, of course, Andrew Wakefield and vaccines, right? And this notion that they were linked to autism. That paper was published in 1998. Many people on the Zoom may recall all this. It was published in 1998. Wasn't retracted until 2010, right? So 12 years of that paper being out there and citable. It's still citable. In fact, it's still cited by other work, often because it's used as an example of something tremendously wrong. But look at what an impact that has had, right? On the sort of, whatever people are calling it now. There's anti-vaccine, there's vaccine hesitancy, there's all of this, and again, there are questions about vaccines. Let's be clear. But there's no evidence, and I have to underscore that completely, that there's linked to any growth in the autism, rates, which I have some expertise in because I'm editor-in-chief of Spectrum here. Lots of other cases, and I think maybe rather than sort of pick a few others, what I would say is that there's a bit of the Richard Nixon effect that sort of attracts us to particular cases. And by that, I mean, the cover-up is almost always worse than the crime. There was one case of a chemist in the Czech Republic, maybe in Czechoslovakia at the time. I'd have to go back and look at that, but it was a chemist in Prague who people started having questions, and so the university did the right thing. They sequestered the lab, they locked the lab, and they wanted to repeat all the experiments and see what happened. They actually, but they noticed that all of the results started coming out the same, almost again too perfectly. So they put a closed circuit TV camera over the door of the lab where the frozen samples were that they were testing. Guess what? He was breaking in every night, and fixing, messing around with what was in the little test tubes and things. Well, he almost certainly did something wrong to begin with, but that sealed the deal, and that was a really prominent case. I could go on with literally dozens of cases we've written. I mean, we've written about hundreds of cases at this point, and I think that again, narrative is what drives journalism in many ways. Narrative is actually what drives science, even though maybe that's a somewhat controversial statement, but it certainly drives what ends up being published, and it drives funding, and it drives all sorts of other things, and even biases. And I think they're important. I think they're critically important because, people go, what? He broke into the lab. And then all of a sudden they're interested in this, what I think are the much larger issues that we'll probably speak about as well, that drive a lot of this behavior and are responsible for, I think, a lot of the misconduct.
A quick, I guess, follow-up to that. Obviously, Wakefield vaccines autism is a shining example of a study that was actually retracted, even though it caused a lot of havoc and pain and suffering, probably deaths. Are there cases of bad science that are published they're demonstrably bad, but they've still not been retracted? Like it was a glitzy story that guided the article being published and being publicized, but it's still there, and it's not retracted. Any examples come to mind?
Sid, there was a great guest post on our website just I want to say last week about I think a case that would fit into, at least loosely, if not quite firmly, into that. And of course, I'm joking, and you're laughing because you were one of the co-authors of that guest post. We didn't time it that way, by the way. It just all sort of happened. But that was a case, and you could speak to it much better than I could, but very, the brief version is a paper claiming that lots of people in Flint had died because of these water filters, right? And when you really dug into what happened, meaning you and Mark Edwards and your colleagues, you realize that they probably they haven't taken into account when the deaths almost certainly happened, but when they had happened. And the cause effect is at best unknown, maybe opposite of what they thought. And so there's this sort of, that's just one example. There are literally, I would say, hundreds of papers that we know about that have been vetted by people we think about as sleuths. We call them sleuths. I don't know if they all call themselves that. People like Elizabeth Bick, who's probably one of the best known, who looks at particularly at image manipulation, but other issues as well. She has a tremendous track record. So it's not just that someone said, oh, I think there's something wrong with this paper. She has documented this carefully. And again, if you look back at her priors, which are, she's a scientist, she's a microbiologist, her work in post-publication peer review, in other words, after it's published, has led to, I don't know, I have an exact number in front of me, but certainly at least hundreds of retractions. I mean, she's right so much of the time. Most of what she has flagged to journals and done in the appropriate way of contacting them, letting them know about it, nothing's happened. And this is years and years later, right? So it's not that that all happened yesterday and, oh, what's going on? There are some other big papers and sort of, honestly, some fundamental papers that people question. And people have had really solid cases about, I mean, one of the, there was a case involving, an antidepressant where it actually would involve, and this is going back 20 years, the study in the paper was found to be fraudulent by a federal judge, in other words, a federal court here in the US. And yet that paper doesn't even have a flag on it right? It doesn't even have sort of a, oh, by the way, you might want to know about this. It just exists, and people have called their attention to it. And that was an antidepressant and children. I mean, it's really quite serious stuff. And I could go on lots of cases. I think one of the sort of things to think about is not so much whether something should be retracted or not, but whether or not the scientific record reflects what we know now that we didn't know when the paper was published. Because I think for reasons, again, that have to do a lot with incentives and the fact that there's this publish or perish culture, and people get so wrapped up. I mean, I know I'm sort of very identified with my own work. When people, when you sort of question their work, you're kind of questioning them. And so I'm not saying it's sort of good, certainly. I'm not even defending it, but the fact, it's not surprising to me that retractions don't happen more often. And so because of all those incentives. And so you almost have to think about not forgetting about retractions, but saying, wait a second, let's just have, let's show in some sort of smart way, when we have the technology for this now, what has happened since people have questioned it, maybe they've actually endorsed it, and they found 12 other studies that say the same thing. Awesome, there's technology for that. But I think you have to sort of think about all that rather than sort of, oh, is this retracted or is this not retracted? And just to sort of close with my answer to this with sort of maybe some numbers, right? So let's be a little bit empirical about it, or evidence-based at least. So, we have about 34,000 retractions in our database now, and that reflects roughly 8 in 10,000 papers that have been retracted. In other words, 8 in 10,000 published papers. Some rough numbers there. Then people always ask, well, how many should be retracted? It's clearly far more than that. Now, is it double that? Is it 100 times that? I mean, I could give you an answer, but that would have large, and I'm sure there are a number of scientists here who will recognize what I'm talking about, but sort of error bars. In other words, like our range of confidence in that is pretty low, or I should say the range of possible answers is likely answers is pretty high. Kind of like, somebody doing a poll, the sort of plus minus the, margin of error. That, roughly speaking, it's the same idea. But if you look at there's some surveys and some sort of just careful analyses of smaller data sets. This figure of about 2% keeps coming up. Like 2% of people sort of admit that they've done something that would be considered misconduct, and therefore, grounds for retraction. And there's some other numbers that I'm sort of doing the high level here. But if you think about 2% versus 8 in 10,000, which is 0.08%, that's a pretty big delta. And I don't know that 2% is the right number. It's probably even larger than that. But, there's a lot that should be retracted that isn't.
Yeah. I think you're citing Daniel Finelli's meta-analysis that's at 2%.
Oh, sorry, if I don't move around in my office,
oh, please.
Turn off.
Yeah, it's 2%
that's right. That's Dan Finelli's 2009. It was a survey plus a meta-analysis, if you will, a
survey
study
right.
of surveys. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And it also found, I think, 2% confessed, which is probably an underestimate, and 14% said they knew of others who had done, bad stuff. Which I want to talk about, young researchers for a few minutes, because especially graduate students, and especially even full professors, when they first hear about misconduct or retractions, especially in their field, God forbid by a colleague, I think the first response, even when I went through all this, was of shock and then denial. Like, that can't be right. We're all good people who want to do the best science that benefits society, the public good, what have you. But 34,000 retractions you've alone documented. So I think what I'm getting at is like a psychological question. Like, what do you tell young people? What do you tell your students about this phenomena? Like, why does it happen? What are some of the motivations of people who do it? How can we better understand what's going on?
Yeah, I actually pulled up a quote, and because I figured something like that would come up, Sid, and this is from, I want to say this is from January 1987. It is an editorial in Science magazine by Daniel Koshland, very eminent scientist, editor-in-chief of Science at that time. 1987 is around the time that, or right after the time that people first started thinking, I wouldn't say first started thinking about scientific fraud, but it became a significant national story because of a couple of particular cases that happened in the 80s. It was also around the time this guy named Al Gore, who was actually calling for he was having hearings on the Hill about this stuff, and they created something called the Office of Scientific Integrity, which became the Office of Research. So it's in that milieu, right? And what didn't come out of nowhere. But I just want to read this, if I may. And this is something, is an editorial where he acknowledges that there's fraud. I mean, he's not claiming there isn't any, but and says it's actually good that we talk about it. But he says, we must recognize that 99.9999, that is basically 100%, a percent of reports are accurate and truthful, often in rapidly advancing frontiers where data are hard to collect. There is no evidence that the small number of cases that have surfaced require a fundamental change in procedures that have produced so much good science. To continue the great advances that are being made, we must accept that perfect behavior is a desirable but unattainable goal. Vigilance, yes. Timidity, no. Now, okay. Bunch of things going on there, which I think reflect this sort of shock that people might have when they first learn about these things. And we hear from so many people who are shocked when it happens to them. In other words, they see a colleague or someone in their field and they realize what's going on. They don't even read about it as a retraction. They see what's happening. And you know how disheartening that is when you've heard that 99.999 and that, yes, you're a good person. And you know what, by the way, I actually think that the vast majority of scientists are sort of well-intentioned. I think the vast majority of people are well-intentioned. There are some notable outliers, but we are also all humans who are absurdly, not absurdly, but just overwhelmingly sort of biased by lots of things. And I don't mean biased in a negative way. It's just, the narratives we come with. And to get back to this narratives question, and I would say to an early career researcher, or anyone even in high school who sort of may hear about this. I mean, we're working right now with this really, really smart high school student who, found Retraction Watch and just thought it was really cool and is doing some projects with us. She's actually probably going to present, we're going to present a paper of hers, or she's going to present it, depending on how we can work that out come fall. Really great. So I know that there are, idealistic is such a strange word, but just sort of like just wide eyes open. And this is someone who she adores science. Like this is how this is the way she thinks, the best way she thinks knowledge should be attained and all of that. But she's working with us at Retraction Watch. She understands full well. Not recommending everyone do that, and we don't have the bandwidth for it, but understand what's really happening, and also wake up every morning, and think about how you might prove yourself wrong. And by the way, I tell my students, my journalism students, this too. And if you at least start with that, you're not always going to act on it. And by the way, you're not always wrong. But if you sort of wake up thinking, how would I prove myself wrong? If nothing else, you have a sort of, you've defanged, a critic who might not be so, even though I think most critics are very well-meaning, who might not be well, because you found the mistake yourself. And that's actually pretty powerful. And that's how science should work. Again, it's how journalism should work too. And I would be the last to say that I actually do that every morning. But if you try and do that, and also just understand, I think, again, the incentive structure that you're working in, it doesn't mean that you can get up and just say, no, I can't do anything about this. But, understand that, again, publish or perish in some way or shape or form, and in publishing in certain journals is going to influence what you do and how you do it. And if you at least start there, then you can hopefully mitigate or at least sort of let that inform you. I mean, there are people working on some really cool, they're all quite experimental and new, but, ways to fund science that, and ways to do science that don't rely on that same paradigm. Again, it's early days, but I would say if there's a way to, you do have to make sure you have a career. I mean, this is the existential challenge that I hear from researchers and scholars and scientists all the time. You have to make sure, otherwise you can't really do much of anything. On the other hand, you have to capitulate to every last, whim of the publish-or-perish system. And I think finding that is important. I think one thing I'd love to see, which I don't see yet quite, is rewarding in the same way we reward publications. We should be rewarding, science should be rewarding finding error. and finding problems and improving the system. It's happening to some extent, but not nearly as much as it can, so that you end up most of the time, unfortunately, as a pariah, as someone who, and there are these cases, and we highlight them, the sleuths that we talk about a lot, but the vast majority of them have left sort of institutional science, if you will. Some of them work in industry, some of them work just on their own or doing something completely different. They're not sort of in the lab anymore, or in the whatever structure there you would think in terms of, and that's often because they're disheartened and because of the way they've been beaten down either directly or indirectly, and we need to change that.
So moving away from the individual and how all of us are affected to a disproportionate degree with, because of the publish and perish culture. It defines, jobs, tenure, promotion, what have you. Let's talk about systems for a second. We hear the sentence, science is self-correcting. I think it's inaccurate. Science is not self-correcting. Scientists correct themselves and each other's. What about institutions like journals and even universities? You talked about rewarding people who find error. Maybe there's a spot for it that counts as a point in a tenure package or what have you. But how are journals generally looking at people who approach them with problems, these sleuths, these whistleblowers? Comments on what you've seen with journals and journal editors.
Yeah, and I will say that we even in the dozen years since we've been doing this, we've seen some positive change. Not all positive, but we've certainly seen some positive change. When we first started, routinely, there's one particular whistleblower who, and I don't know if whistleblower is the right term, but sleuth, sort of critic, who found us very quickly. And then, if I went back into my emails from the last 12 years, I haven't done a count, but probably thousands of emails from this particular person, and not obsessive kind of, anything, just factual kind of, something I found, something else I found. And so, but routinely, and this person would also copy us into correspondence with journals. So we knew exactly what was happening. Early on, we called the journal editor, Adam Marcus, my co-founder, called the journal editor after a retraction that we didn't think included very much information. This person, a surgeon, picked up the phone and said, and then Adam asked, well, can you tell us more? And said, it's none of your damn business. He then went into a tirade about, if you get divorced, it's no one else's business what happened. And Adam was like, well, true. How is that related to a paper that, other researchers are reading and it was actually guiding clinical practice, and maybe we'd want to know what went wrong. Anyway, that was the kind of response we got. It was the kind of response that sleuths were getting. Things have changed in a couple of important ways. And one is that there's a site called PubPeer, pubpeer.com, which some people on the Zoom may know about, where, again, I mentioned Elizabeth Bick, people like that post their critiques, often anonymously. She doesn't do it anonymously, but often anonymously. That was launched, I want to say, end of 2012. It was 2012 or 2013. And full disclosure, I'm a volunteer on their board of directors because I believe very strongly in what they do. That has given an outlet. That is, and maybe it's a bit of public shaming for journals who used to like to bury their, sort of bury their problems under the rug, sweep their problems under the rug. So that's had an effect, clearly. In fact, we're presenting an abstract next week at a big research integrity conference showing that, not cause effect, actually, I should be careful there, but certainly a correlation between comments and retractions. The other thing that's happened that's positive is that a number of journals, and some of them actually go back quite a ways, probably to 2010 or so, have hired people that they call sort of something like research integrity managers. And they're actually going back through the backlog. They're realizing that they had no resources, no bandwidth, even though some of these journals are published by multi-billion-dollar companies, they claimed, and maybe because of the way the resources were allocated, they didn't have the bandwidth to actually go through all these concerns and all these allegations. So these folks are at a handful of journals, a growing handful, are going back through those and also looking at issues beforehand so that maybe they won't get published at all, right? In other words, things that shouldn't have gotten through peer review now maybe will be less likely to get through peer review. And so those are all positive. Now, are there still tons of journal editors who ignore or find reasons to discount critics. And, oh, we don't want to talk to anonymous critics. Absolutely. And we've honestly, everyone I know in science who's tried to raise an allegation will tell you that story. And I don't want to be, certainly don't want to be Pollyannish or too optimistic. I like to think of myself as a sort of optimistic cynic, if that makes any sense. But we have seen some movement, and we hope that a lot of that takes off.
I want to shift gears for a few minutes and talk about the role of internet and social media. You mentioned PubPeer. I think it's primarily a positive. There are bigger conversations about cancel culture and social media mobs sometimes coming after people, all that. Sometimes they find, stuff that should be retracted. That's, you talked about this. You had a Wired article that was titled "Science Journals Are Purging Racist, Sexist Work." Finally, there's stuff that is both wrong and outrageous. It needs to be called out. So that's the good part. But on the other hand, you also have the excesses of these platforms that in the name of criticism, all you are seeing is ad hominem attacks. And there are cases of doctors in COVID, for example, who've been fairly or unfairly smeared. We can talk, but I'm interested in your view about this culture of attacking and perhaps help us see through what the good that's come from social media and perhaps some of the dangers that you see.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think I should be clear. Again, PubPeer, there's a moderation policy. Something that's purely ad hominem is really not supposed to be there. I'm sure things slip through. I don't want to be naive, but the whole point is it has to be publicly available, and it could be that you've posted a document on PubPeer, but it's publicly available and verifiable. And it's just, this image looks the same as this image from another paper. That shouldn't be. This text comes from this other place. Okay, so that to me, and again, I'm not saying it's perfect, but that is about scientific criticism. It may be sharp. It may feel really uncomfortable if you're on the receiving end of it, but that is scientific criticism. And we can have a discussion about, there's a little bit of a movement now to make peer review kinder, and to make it more gentle. And I have to say that the examples people show of this was a terribly unprofessional attack, I go, no, that in the vast majority of cases, I go, no, if that's the most unprofessional attack you can come up with, right? That like this paper is unclear and kind of, maybe stronger language than that. That's not actually an ad hominem attack. It means your paper's not, and that maybe there's a bad mistake in it. But I do think you're right that everything can be weaponized. The process of retraction can be weaponized. It has been weaponized. Sorry if the noise outside my window in New York City is weaponized right now. You may hear the siren. And so I think that we have to be mindful of that. Several colleagues, a couple of colleagues and I wrote a piece that ran a few years ago in the American Scientist about sort of the notion of doubt and sort of, intellectually honest doubt, intellectually dishonest doubt. And I think we have to be mindful of all that. There is also a narrative that happens often, which is, well, they're only attacking my work or attacking me, which is part of it, which I don't think is appropriate, but they're only attacking my work because, I'm right. And because, I'm countering the narrative, the official narrative. I get that. But I also have to say that in the vast majority of those cases, I look at it and say, well, actually, your evidence is not so great. So maybe the narrative you're now enmeshed with is the notion that you're only being criticized, your work is only being criticized because you're countering the narrative, but maybe your narrative is problematic, right? So I'm glad that you mentioned this piece, which we got some flack for, I have to say, the Wired piece. There were plenty of very thoughtful people who really didn't agree, which is obviously fine, didn't think our conclusions were valid, and I respect that. Got into some, engaged in some conversations with those people on and offline. But I'm glad that you pointed out that one of the things we mentioned is, no, the papers were wrong and outrageous. They were wrong and racist. And the problem that happens now, or one of the problems that happens, I hate the, you should hardly ever use the. A problem that happens now is that, when people start talking about cancel culture and all this, which you mentioned, that they either ignore, willfully or not, the fact that there are deep flaws in this work. And so the deep flaws are what we should be concerned about. And if they led to a racist or sexist or any other ist idea or conclusion, then that should be retracted. It's wrong. It is not. Now, does it capture more attention? And does it seem that it's more likely to be retracted because of the conclusions? I cannot disagree with that, right? That's absolutely true. You could even sort of, to be a little bit ridiculous, say that those papers are being profiled because of their conclusions, because of their, at best, sort of uncomfortable conclusions, at worst, virulently somethingist conclusions. But the problem is, and then, the problem is that you then sort of, you have people say, well, therefore it's unfair. Well, nothing's fair. It's about whether or not the work holds up. There's a lot of other work that should also be retracted. It doesn't have that political or, emotional or, identity valence. Like, an obscure paper that has a Western blot, which is, again, for those of you who aren't familiar, sort of a way that, I'm going to oversimplify, the way that scientists, look at what proteins are sort of in a sample or in a cell or something like that. Look it up for more information that's more accurate than what I just said, but broadly speaking, okay, and it's obscure and it's about some pathway in mice, and it doesn't really ever lead anything to anything anyway, and people say, well, that that should be retracted. Well, yeah, it should be retracted if it's wrong and if the Western blot's been manipulated. But the point we're trying to make in that piece is we should get to those now. Like if the point is there's too much of the attention being paid to the papers that are problematic because they're ists of some kind, fine, I get it. But that doesn't mean apply less pressure or apply less scrutiny to those papers. It means apply more to all the other papers. Make this part of the process and the conversation. Again, that's not necessarily an opinion held by everyone. But part of the sort of, I think there's just obviously active academic freedom and freedom of speech discussion happening, which is critically important. As a journalist, of course, I'm completely and wholeheartedly about freedom of speech, even if freedom of speech that I disagree with. It does not mean that criticism of that freedom, of that sort of really badly argued opinion, is automatically cancel culture. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to do that. The very same freedom of speech allows that we let people say whatever they want, make the conclusions, and it is both understandable and, frankly, I would argue a good thing if you allow your priors. In other words, that person has been wrong about so many things. Like, maybe I don't trust that person's judgment all that much anymore, and you're free to sort of continue talking and tweet and do whatever you want. I'm not going to take all that very seriously. I'm a Bayesian, I guess, in terms of logic. And, you gotta think that. On the other hand, if someone's been right about 100 things and is wrong about one, I go, okay, that's a pretty good record. And I'm going to probably sort of at least, sort of begin the thinking about the next paper that person publishes or utterance that person has in a sort of, probably likely to be true light. And I think that that's what's getting lost, and that we're sort of turning this all into a binary, again, retracted, not retracted. Well, there are obvious things that should definitely be retracted. Everything else is kind of gray, because even a paper that is fundamentally right and is going to be over time, not proven wrong, but be shown to be a small part of a much larger sort of, set of data points or sort of understanding or theory or theorem. And that's good. We shouldn't retract that paper, but we should sort of understand that everything's gray, right?
Right. I think this reminds me of the distinction I read in a Slate piece once, which is there should be a clear distinction between criticism of a scientist's work and a scientist. So that's important. Before I hand it over to the audience, I I think let's talk very quickly about viewpoint diversity. I think you touched on it with freedom of speech and the First Amendment. And academic freedom allows you to say things that are unpopular in the pursuit of what's true. Do you think that still has value, like people who hold unpopular opinions about a particular scientific issue? Do you think the political culture, broadly speaking, allows them to post that online, or and is you know, is it okay to do if you're acting in good faith?
I think absolutely. I do. You know, I don't read minds. I partially trained as a psychiatrist. That still doesn't give me clairvoyance, right? So I generally and almost never really know whether someone is well-intentioned or not in what they're saying. So I can't judge it based on that. I have to judge it based on, does this actually hold up? What is it leaving out? And I think that is one of the sort of the omissions to me have become not more important, but the way that, and I'll use the word, even though it's probably pretty loaded, it is loaded, the way that propaganda has propagated, right? So it isn't so much that the fact that you are offering is true or not. In other words, if we ran around at Retraction Watch, which, by the way, the idea that science is maybe not as self-correcting or scientists are not as self-correcting as, you know, they'd like to think they are, or that they're telling people they are, that's not a very popular view in certain quarters, right? It's a very popular view in other quarters, maybe too popular in other quarters, but okay, fine. So I'm familiar with the concept, if you will, of speaking my mind and hopefully in a data-driven way that others can judge. But for example, if we were to just say, there were, because on average it's true, there are 3,300 retractions a year now, right? So I could sort of stand up somewhere every day and say, there were 10 retractions today. Science is broken. You know, if I did that, which is akin to some of what you see with these very selective, cherry-picked, you know, tweets you see, and you know, oh, this happened. Well, it did happen, but the other 12 things that happened, you know, expand the frame. If I said that and said and didn't provide the denominator, which is that, you know, I don't know how many tens of thousands of papers were published yesterday, even though more should be retracted, I should note, of course, as we discussed. Well, then I would be guilty of the same thing. And whether it's good, well-intentioned or not is irrelevant to the fact that I've omitted context. And that is, to me, what I sort of see as I don't know, that to me seems like a big problem. And it is not just on Twitter and social media, it's actually true in a scientific study, right? You can only present a certain amount, plus you're incentivized to only present the very smallest, what are, you know, you're of course familiar with the notion of salami slicing, right? Because you need to publish another paper. So you're not going to tell the entire story. You don't have time, probably. You're not going to tell as broad a story as you can. You're going to tell, there's a concept of least publishable unit, an LPU, right? And so, you know, and it's sort of like, and again, journalism, it's the same thing. I don't want to exempt ourselves. Like, you know, people got to put out a paper. Well, they used to have to put out a paper every day. They got to have something to post today to get everybody's attention. So I think it's critically important. It's just a question of, are you providing enough context for what you're saying and what you're arguing, and then let people be the judge of that.
Okay. With that, we'll move to questions. Again, you can either, everyone who's online, you could use the chat option or the Q&A, doesn't matter. If you have questions for Ivan, just put them in the box. One question I have is from Joseph Graff. He says, I'm in the social sciences, and I don't see as many retractions in the social sciences as there are in the health sciences or the hard sciences, if you will. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I mean, just numbers wise, you are correct. And what I would also say is that you know, there aren't so many papers published. I mean, I think, you know, it is always, again, I just was talking about context and denominators. You know, if you were to sort of just the 3 million or so papers published every year, something like 80% of them are in something that you would consider, you know, the life sciences, and that could be everything from stuff in a test tube and mice to clinical trials. I mean, and that's, I saw actually in the chat that somebody said 80% of statistics are made up on the spot. That one isn't, but you should fact check me anyway. But my point is that the denominator is much smaller, so you wouldn't expect as many. But also remember, in humanities, I'm not saying remember, the humanities, it's not, you don't have sort of a data set, right? And then you sort of are, that you could sort of manipulate. Now people do, but often what we see is sort of plagiarism. There's one sleuth named Michael Dougherty. He's at Dominion, I'm going to get the name wrong, but I want to say Dominion University in Ohio, and he's become just a force in terms of plagiarism, and in religious studies, for example, and philosophy in particular. And so there actually are a number, and I'd have to go to the database. I want to take the time now and get you in a sort of actual accurate number, but they happen. But you're right that it's not the same, because there isn't, and I would, maybe to be a little bit cynical, the stakes are not necessarily as high, right? In other words, if you are coming up with, for good reason, sort of curing a disease or treating a disease, or you have a patent on something, or you're going to market something, or you're an engineer and you're sort of going to sell a product, that doesn't really happen in humanities. I mean, you sell books and you get tenure, but it's a little bit different.
Thank you for that. Howard would like to know, what if we confirmed our results by having a collaborator confirm the results before they're published? I think he's talking about, we publish something and then someone checks it and then publishes another paper. If I'm getting this correctly, this is counter to what is expected for promotion and tenure. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's absolutely counter to what is expected, and not so much that it's counter as much as nobody allows for that, right? So you've got to publish, you've got to sort of publish certain amount of papers. To have someone replicate, or try and reproduce results every single time, it would just slow the whole process down. It would make for better science. I mean, I don't think that's controversial, but do you really have the time and space and resources? There's no money for that either. I want to say it was, I think it was the Netherlands, but again, I need to be fact checked on this. Maybe in Denmark, somewhere in sort of Northern Europe. There was several years ago, sort of, I think it was 3 million euros, so obviously not a huge amount, that was earmarked part of the sort of research funding budget just for replication. So you applied just for, and which was, again, just a bit of a pilot to see what would happen, and I should follow up and see what happened. But that's again, sort of a nod to the fact that these things should happen. The Center for Open Science, of course, has led a lot of replication efforts, reproducibility in cancer and psychology. So that's all critical. We wrote a piece, Adam and I, in Wired also, sort of about the notion of red teams, right? So in other words, and this is picking up on an idea that, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Daniel Lockins had come up with, in terms of, not so much like replicating the whole study, but having someone else do the analysis to see if it sort of holds up. So there are ways to get at this without sort of, going full bore, if you will, that I think are worth trying. Again, is it a fund? Is it the sort of red team idea where you just present your data? And by the way, that isn't a critical way, that not that it doesn't cost anything, but being open source about your data. In other words, publishing your data alongside, and even if it's only allowing people to do, that allows people to do it after the fact. But one of the interesting things, that's of course happening, is that you're all aware of, is preprints, right? And the notion that, okay, we're talking about publish or perish, still true, but now so many fields, I mean, again, during the pandemic, this just exploded. We could have a whole other discussion, right, about just, the role of preprints and what have you. But that's essentially it. Again, it's open access, so you can see everything. If you post your data alongside this preprint, which is not peer reviewed, just to be clear, and it's very clear it's not peer reviewed, then you have open, then you can actually let other people look at it. Maybe not before you published it, but again, in terms of publish or perish, getting there first is a pretty important thing, and we can defend that or not. But when you publish it, when you post a preprint, okay, you did it first, and if it holds up, you were the one who did it first, and yet you haven't sort of codified it and written it in the stone of a major journal that is going to take everything to retract it, as opposed to you're going to maybe just post another version of the preprint and then publish it in a journal when it's essentially been peer reviewed before it even got to be submitted to the journal.
Do you think journals, by and large, are warming up to publishing final versions of preprints, like most of them will consider and put it through review?
Yeah, I do think they are. I think, and I should also disclose as part of the Simons Fund, as an employee of the Simons Foundation, I'm now on the Scientific Advisory Board of Archive, which is one of the big and arguably the first kind of big preprint server. Again, a volunteer position, but it is part of my role here. So I do think journals, after kicking and screaming and doing everything they could, by the way, even going back to the 1950s and 60s, before the internet existed, they were trying to kill what would be considered preprint servers now. They were, I guess, preprint, like sort of manila envelopes, sort of mailing things to people.
Yes.
Journal, for the most part, even the holdouts have said, yes, we recognize the value here. We are willing to say that we're willing to sort of claim and stand on the fact that we add value in peer review, which we could have a whole other discussion about. And so, we're comfortable with that. And in fact, good, things get out there, but then it's the official version, the sort of published version is with us, and maybe it's different, maybe it's not. So that's definitely happening in lots of fields. To be a bit cynical, some of that is because the publishers have realized they can also make money, sort of owning the preprint, creating a preprint server or owning it. So SSRN, which is the big social sciences research network, basically it is a preprint server. They call it something different, but it's a preprint server. That's now owned by Elsevier. American Chemical Society, which yes is a nonprofit, but sort of acts like a big corporation. They fought against preprints in chemistry forever. And then all of a sudden, when they created ChemArchive, and which they own, they said, oh, we think preprints are great and everyone should submit to them before they publish in our journals. So I don't know. I don't even know if I am cynical. I sometimes feel cynical, but I think the tide is turned, and the pandemic made these front page, the word preprints appearing on front pages of newspapers.
Yeah, it's also scary because many of these these articles did not mention that the findings they were quoting came from preprints and so on.
Well, there was a paper that I didn't know was coming out until it came out, so I couldn't have had any influence on it, but it made me laugh. And it's by it was a number of researchers, but the person who led it is someone named Alice Fleerackers, who's out in British Columbia. Great, I think she's either a grad student or a postdoc now, but early in her training,
career, yes,
yeah, does really smart. She's published a couple other things. But one of the funny things, it turns out she was looking at Medscape, which is where I was before I was here during the pandemic, and looking at whether or not we mentioned that something was in a preprint serve, and I think we did better than pretty much everyone when you so it's like, oh, I guess my worlds collide and all that, but I've gotten to know her work a bit, and we talk every now and then, and definitely worth following. Just her work is really I think she understands the world and that we're living in, and understands the sort of competing forces, and but preprints, they're not going anywhere, and we're there now.
Yeah, I think on that list, the Times ranked the lowest, which was
Times didn't do that
scary. Was very scary. Okay, one quick final question, and then we'll wrap up. This comes from Rose Nelson. She would like to know, what advice would you give to early graduate students for both avoiding and recognizing questionable papers, and I guess avoiding mistakes in your own research?
Right. So let me give you a sort of a bit of a plug, if you will, and hopefully this is okay. Again, I'm a volunteer at Traction Watch, but we do have to keep the lights on. We partner with several different bibliographic sort of software in other words, bibliographic management software, things like EndNote, Zotero, and also something called Papers. And you can actually Zotero is free, actually totally open source. The others, if you're at a university, you may have access to, or you pay individually. But they actually ingest our database, so that whenever you are in your, and you'll get, actually, you don't have to be in it, you'll get an alert whenever something in your library, in other words, your own database, that you might be citing or thinking about citing or did cite once, is retracted. You'll get an alert, and kind of cool. We love that because it's exactly, now that's for retracted papers. So let's just be clear. And that's again probably a minority of problematic papers in the world. But you can at least start there. You can go to, again, PubPeer, full disclosure, again, volunteer board of directors there, but you can get an extension, a Chrome extension, I think many browsers now, but an extension that whenever you're on a paper, it'll tell you, oh, by the way, there's a comment about this paper on PubPeer. You may want to check it out. Maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not, maybe it's wrong, frankly, but at least you'll know. After that, I would actually recommend looking also at the alt metrics in a paper. So again, alt metrics to me as a metric, as a number, is just as problematic. We didn't talk about this much as trying to assign a number to anything else. But what alt metrics does is it tells you whether has somebody been tweeting about this, blogging about it, newspaper coverage, and you can maybe get a sense that a lot of those tweets are kind of negative or they're raising questions about it. If you add those three things together, some kind of, some software that ingests our database of retractions, PubPeer extension, and looking at alt metrics for papers you're looking at, I think you're not going to capture everything, but it'll start to give you a flavor of things, and you might start to see patterns yourself. But I would recommend all those.
Perfect. With that, this brings us to the end of a very fruitful hour. Ivan, I cannot thank you enough again for taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. I'm sorry, I was just looking, there was a comment that came up, so I thought we were going to look at that, but no, I really, Sid, look, and I also, you're very kind to, we do, again, we're a nonprofit and we always can welcome support, and we very much appreciate that. And you're very kind to suggest people support our work. I also want to just turn that around and say that, and again, we posted something which I would urge you to all look at, that Sid and his colleagues co-authored. I think it was last week, maybe it was a week before, weeks and fly by. It was in the last couple of weeks, about their experience trying to correct the record. Really vital stuff, but even larger than that, the work that Sid and Mark, and I know there are others on the team whose names are of course escaping me right now, the work that they've been doing over time to, again, raise awareness of these issues within their own field and in larger fields, definitely worth following. So I would definitely make a plug for that as well.
Thank you. It's not been fun, but I guess it's important work. Okay, thanks again. Thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your day. And join me in thanking Ivan in the chat, if you will.
Thank you all.